My name is Irene Alden, and I'm 63 years old. There's no space for you in this house." The words didn't come with a raised voice or a slammed door. They were said over morning coffee in the same room where I had once been told I'd never have to lift a finger again. Now, months later, I was sitting alone in a modest motel room, staring at a folding chair, and two suitcases that held what was left of a life I thought I'd built with love. A frayed quilt lay folded at the edge of the bed, the same one Daniel and I used to bring on picnics when Caleb was a boy. And tucked neatly in my bag was a red folder containing the deed to the very house I had been asked to leave. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight back. But this is the story of how I quietly walked away, and quietly changed everything. 5 years ago, I never could have imagined this ending. Back then, I had a husband, a home filled with shared history, and a son I believed would always look out for me. Daniel passed away from pancreatic cancer. Swift, cruel final. We'd been married 37 years. When he died, there wasn't much left in terms of assets, but there was a life insurance policy, $175,000. Every cent of it I gave to Caleb. Not because I didn't understand money or because I was too soft, but because I truly believed in him. He was my only child. He and Lena, his wife, were newly married at the time and struggling to qualify for a mortgage on a house just outside Charlotte. I remember the night he called. It was late, past midnight. His voice cracked when he spoke. He said they'd found the perfect place. 4 bedrooms, clean lines, brand new appliances, a little fenced yard. He said they were just short of approval, but with some help they could finally settle into their future. I didn't hesitate. Of course I'll help, I told him. The money was wired the next morning. No questions, no strings. I thought I was helping him start a life, maybe even secure a home for myself one day. A few weeks later, they invited me to move in with them. Not because I asked, not because I had nowhere else to go. They insisted. Lena hugged me tightly and said, "You'll always have a place here." Caleb kissed my forehead and promised I'd never have to worry again. I believed them. Maybe I wanted to believe them too much. The house was beautiful. Too beautiful. White walls that looked untouched, floors the color of driftwood, minimalist furniture that belonged on the pages of a magazine. My room was technically a guest suite on the ground floor. It didn't have a closet. The bed was a twin pushed up against the wall, and the bathroom was only a half bath with no shower. Still, I didn't mind. I told myself it was temporary, that the gesture of being welcomed was what truly mattered. I cooked dinner those first few nights. Lena's favorite pasta, Caleb's childhood favorite stew. We all sat at the table, real napkins, glasses of wine, the clatter of forks and conversation mixing like music. There were moments, quiet ones, where I let myself believe this might work. Mornings when I woke up to the sound of laughter upstairs. Evenings when Lena asked about my old job at the library. Times when Caleb made my coffee just the way I liked it, extra cream, no sugar, sliding the mug across the counter without even needing to ask. But something small started to change. Not a sharp turn, just a slow drift. I noticed it at dinner mostly. The first time it happened, Lena said she was eating upstairs because she had a headache. Caleb followed her. I sat at the table alone, the napkin still folded in my lap. Another night, Caleb said he had a work call and grabbed a plate to go. Then Lena stopped setting 3 places. Sometimes she didn't set the table at all. Sometimes they said they had already eaten. The chair I used to sit in, the one closest to the window, started to feel more like decoration than a seat. Some nights I didn't bother coming to the kitchen at all. I made toast and tea in silence and ate in my room. I told myself they were tired, busy, adjusting to new routines. But something in my chest knew better. It's strange how absence makes more noise than presence. I would walk through the house and feel like a shadow. Not ignored exactly, but unseen. The same walls I helped them paint, the same hallways where my footsteps once echoed with purpose now felt foreign. I had paid for this space, stood behind their dreams, made sacrifices they hadn't even noticed. And yet day by day it was as if the air around me shifted. Thinner, colder, more conditional. There's a unique kind of ache that settles in your bones when the people you've loved most make you feel like extra weight. Not through cruelty, not through yelling or blame, but through silence, through indifference, through the slow, quiet removal of space once offered freely. I started spending more time in my room. I folded laundry no one asked me to fold. I wiped counters already clean. I listened for footsteps upstairs, not because I wanted to interrupt, but because I didn't want to appear too visible. I stopped asking if they wanted tea, stopped offering to cook. I started becoming what they had not said out loud, but had clearly shown a guest. And so every night I found myself returning to the same chair at the kitchen table, now untouched, just to look at it, to remember that once, not long ago, I had been invited to fill it. The house I helped build became the first place I disappeared. It didn't happen all at once. That's the trick about unraveling. You rarely notice the first thread come loose. It begins so quietly that you don't even think to tug at it. You just keep moving, keep folding towels, wiping counters, rinsing mugs, humming to fill the silence. You tell yourself everything's fine because no one has said otherwise. Until one day the space you occupy no longer feels like yours, and you realize that silence has said quite a bit. The first signs were almost imperceptible. Lena was cooking dinner, chatting on speakerphone with a friend while I was just a few feet away drying dishes. Her voice was cheerful, animated, almost performative. I wasn't trying to listen, but it's hard not to overhear when someone's standing right next to you. Then I heard her laugh and say, "I live with 2 kids and a grandma." The way she stretched that last word, grandma, it didn't feel warm. It felt like a punchline. Like I was an add-on, a joke her friends would understand without explanation. I didn't flinch. I didn't let the dish rag pause in my hand. I just smiled into the sink and kept drying like I hadn't heard a thing. Later that evening, when she passed me the salad bowl at dinner, she did it with a pleasant smile, and I responded with my usual thank you, as if nothing inside me had curled in. Then there were the sighs. Caleb started sighing whenever I asked small things that used to be met with simple, kind answers. One afternoon, I asked if I might put a little shelf up in the laundry room. Just something small from the hardware store, a place to keep my detergent and fabric softener so I wouldn't have to store them in a plastic tub on the floor. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just sighed, said, "We'll see," and walked away. It wasn't a no, but it also wasn't a yes. The in-between began to grow louder than any refusal ever could. One morning I opened the refrigerator in the main kitchen to grab some milk for my tea and was met with resistance. I tugged again. Still locked. A silver padlock had been looped through the handles. For a second I thought I was dreaming. I stared at it like maybe I had opened the wrong fridge. Lena walked in holding a smoothie bottle and wearing that easy smile of hers. "Oh, I had to lock it," she said, like it was nothing. "Meal prepping. Everything has to stay organized or else it gets chaotic." I nodded slowly, closing the door, and walked to the garage to use the spare fridge, the one with expired yogurt cups and forgotten leftovers in foil. Then the Wi-Fi stopped working in my room. At first I thought maybe it was the weather. I restarted my tablet. Nothing. My phone refused to load even the weather app. I unplugged and replugged the router downstairs, only to find it gone. After 3 days of radio silence and no internet, I finally asked. "Oh," Caleb said casually. I moved the modem to my office upstairs. Needed stronger signal for work calls. I waited for him to offer a solution. He didn't. Later that evening, I asked Lena if she might have the new password. She rolled her eyes like I'd asked her to solve a calculus equation, typed it into a slip of paper without a word, and handed it to me before walking away. I thanked her anyway. Quietly. I always did. There's a strange sort of emptiness that grows in places that are supposed to be shared. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't bang on doors or scream in the night. It's subtle. It's in the way no one asks if you'd like to go grocery shopping anymore, in how they walk past you on the couch without a glance, in the smile that looks rehearsed, in the way they speak just a little louder around you, as if you're starting to go deaf. Still, I tried not to assume anything. I told myself they were stressed, young, juggling jobs, bills, a new home. Maybe they were just adjusting. Maybe I was being too sensitive, old-fashioned, in the way. And then came the moment that changed everything, not in action but in awareness. It was late, nearly midnight. I had trouble sleeping that night. My ankles ached and the quilt was too warm, so I decided to make some chamomile tea. I slipped out of my room, careful not to make noise. The house was dark except for a faint light in the kitchen. As I neared the end of the hallway, I heard Lena's voice. She was on the phone speaking in that tight, low tone people use when they're trying not to be overheard. But don't know someone is already listening. I mean, she's sweet. Lena said, her words clipped, but this isn't sustainable. We need our own life. There was a pause. She's always here. It's like we're never really alone. The mug in my hand suddenly felt heavy. My fingers tightened around the handle. I stood still in the hallway, unable to walk forward, unwilling to back away. I felt my body pressing into the wallpaper, holding my breath as if breathing would make the moment real. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't want to. I turned around, walked back to my room as quietly as I had come, and sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like an hour. The tea never got made. In the morning, I folded laundry that wasn't mine. I wiped crumbs that weren't there. I avoided the kitchen at lunchtime. When Caleb walked past me without eye contact, I told myself he was distracted. When Lena dropped her car keys and I picked them up for her, she gave a quick thanks and walked out the door. And I thought maybe this is just how love fades, not in the big moments, but in the quiet decisions to make space smaller. To speak less, to notice less. They hadn't asked me to leave, but something inside me was already wondering if I should. I always woke up early. Years of habit, I suppose. Even after I retired, I found comfort in morning stillness. The sound of a quiet house, the way the light stretched across the floor before anyone else stirred. That morning was no different. I tiptoed into the hallway, thinking I'd make tea and sit on the porch for a bit. But as I neared the kitchen, I heard voices from the living room. They weren't arguing. That's what struck me first. No yelling, no whispers of tension, just calm, measured voices, the kind you might use when planning a grocery list or deciding what movie to watch. But what they were saying had nothing to do with groceries. Caleb's voice was low, almost tired. "She won't leave if we're too nice," he said. "We've got to push her out quietly. No fight." I stopped walking. The hallway light buzzed faintly overhead. Then Lena's voice clipped and careful. Colder than I thought she'd ever be. "She won't sign over her share unless she feels unwanted. Make her uncomfortable, she'll leave herself." I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, my hand brushing the edge of the wallpaper I had helped pick out 6 months earlier. I remembered standing with Lena in the hardware store comparing swatches. She had held up this exact pattern and said it felt modern but still warm. I looked at that wall now and it felt like someone else had chosen it. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't interrupt. I didn't let them know I had heard. I turned around, walked softly back to my bedroom, and sat on the twin bed in the same posture I'd used as a girl in Sunday school. Hands folded, knees together, head bowed. Not from prayer. From something like surrender. I didn't cry. I just stared at my suitcase, the one still tucked under the bed from when I first moved in. That night I cooked chicken Alfredo. Caleb's favorite. I set the table like I always had lit a candle even though the sun hadn't yet gone down. I waited. I listened for footsteps, laughter, the sound of chairs being pulled out. None came. The food cooled. I washed the dishes, dried them, and placed the leftovers in the fridge no one used anymore. The next morning I was at the sink rinsing strawberries when Lena came in. Her tone was light, her arms folded across her chest in that way that made her look polished, composed. She said she and Caleb had been talking, that maybe it was time for me to find something more permanent. She repeated that word, permanent, as if it were a kindness. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I turned off the faucet and looked at her still holding a damp paper towel. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. because a moment later Caleb walked in behind her holding his coffee mug like it was just any other morning. He didn't meet my eyes. He just said flatly, "We don't have space for you anymore, Mom. You need to go." There was no anger in his voice, no guilt, just an eerie, detached finality. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask where this version of my son had come from or what exactly had changed. I simply looked at them both and nodded. "Okay," I said. "I'll be out by tonight." Lena blinked, caught off guard. Caleb gave a small satisfied nod like checking off a task from a list. "Thanks," he said, already turning away. I walked back to my room and sat on the bed for a few minutes. Then I opened the closet. If you could call a dresser and coat hook a closet, and began folding my clothes. I wrapped my husband's photo in the quilt we had brought from the old house. I packed my toiletries, my books a small tin of lavender tea. Every movement was careful, gentle, as if I were cleaning up someone else's space. I zipped the final suitcase and placed it by the door. I didn't feel like a mother at that moment. I felt like a guest whose reservation had quietly expired. I didn't wake up with a plan that morning. There was no moment of resolve, no cinematic music swelling behind me, just sunlight creeping through the blinds and the same aching in my knees that came with every new day. I moved slowly, not because I was sad, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said. The words had hung in the air long enough. They didn't echo anymore. They had settled. And now it was time to leave. I made my bed first. I always do, even in motels or hospitals. It's something I've carried with me from childhood. If the bed is made, the day has structure. That morning I smoothed the corners of the twin mattress I'd been sleeping on for months, and tucked the quilt tightly around the edges, careful not to wrinkle the photograph of Daniel I had placed there the night before. I had wrapped it in that same quilt, a navy one worn soft from years of use, its frayed edge tucked under the corner of the frame. The picture was from the summer before he died. He was wearing his old fishing hat, the one Caleb used to try on and laugh in as a boy. Daniel's smile in the photo was crooked mid-laugh. I took that picture. It was the kind of smile I hadn't seen in this house since the day he left us. I opened the bottom drawer of the dresser. Just 2 drawers, and the rails always stuck a little when pulled too far. At the very back, under a manila envelope of pension paperwork and a printed copy of my last pharmacy order, was the red folder. I slid it out carefully. The plastic had dulled at the edges, and there was a faint smudge where a teacup had once rested on it. I hadn't touched it since moving in, but I always knew it was there. Inside was the document they had likely forgotten about, or maybe chosen to believe I had. The house deed, black ink on heavy paper, and there listed plainly next to Caleb's name was mine, 49% co-owner, a number that didn't sound like much when spoken aloud but looked entirely different when written in legal terms. I sat with it for a moment, reading and rereading that single line. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reality, like something I had quietly carried with me the whole time, unsure when, or if, I'd ever need to use it. I packed my clothes slowly, folded each item like it mattered. I didn't have much, a few cardigans, some soft cotton pants, 2 pairs of shoes, 1 dressy one for walking. I rolled up a few pairs of socks and tucked them into the corners of the suitcase. My books went next, 2 worn paperbacks, and an old leather-bound journal I hadn't written in since Daniel's funeral. I placed the toiletries in a resealable bag, slid everything into the second suitcase, and zipped it shut. I didn't tell Caleb or Lena I was leaving. I didn't think they'd ask. Caleb had gone to work that morning without a word. Lena had nodded at me when she passed through the kitchen, earbuds and smoothie in hand, already halfway into her day. I don't know if they expected me to stay another night or disappear midweek, but they didn't ask, and I didn't offer. I ordered a cab from my phone, the same app Lena had installed for me months ago when I said I didn't like bothering them for rides. I rolled my 2 suitcases through the front door and down the walkway without a sound. The wheels bumped gently over the cobblestone path Caleb and I had laid together when he was in middle school. He had been so proud of those stones, arranging them with precision, measuring and remeasuring the gaps. I remembered how he used to call them castle rocks and pretend our front yard was a fortress. The image made something tighten in my chest, but I didn't let it linger. The cab pulled up right on time. The driver was young and polite and didn't say much beyond asking if I needed help with the bags. I told him I was fine. I didn't need to be helped into the back seat. I didn't need to be asked where I was going or why. I held the red folder in my lap, resting both hands on it like it might float away if I let go. The ride was quiet. I watched the familiar streets pass by neighborhoods I'd once driven through with Daniel on lazy Sunday afternoons. Everything looked the same and yet completely foreign. Somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of the house as mine. Maybe I had never truly believed it was. Maybe I had wanted so badly to be part of their future that I forgot how quickly futures can change when they stop including you. The motel was nothing special. A one-story building with chipped paint, a tired front desk clerk, and a soda machine that made more noise than it was worth. But it was clean, quiet, mine. I paid in cash for 3 nights and declined housekeeping. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want anyone to see how little I had with me. 2 bags, 1 quilt, 1 photograph, and the red folder. My room was at the end of the row farthest from the front office. The key was an actual metal key, not a card, and it stuck a little in the lock. Inside, the carpet was thin, and the curtains were faded, but there was a small desk by the window and a bedside lamp that worked. I unpacked only what I needed: nightclothes, toothbrush, Daniel's photo. I placed the red folder in the drawer, closed it gently, and lay down on the bed. The mattress creaked beneath me. The ceiling was low-textured and stained in one corner with something brown and vague. The lamp flickered a little when I turned it off. I kept the room dark except for the light from the hallway seeping under the door. I didn't cry that night. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt finished. The motel room didn't have a view worth remembering. Outside the window was a gravel lot half filled with faded sedans and a single pickup with a rusting bumper. But I found myself sitting there for a long time that morning anyway, sipping from a lukewarm paper cup of instant coffee, watching the breeze move through the thinning branches of a small maple tree just outside. It was late October, and most of the leaves had already given up. The few that clung to the limbs fluttered like they knew what was coming. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have anywhere to be. That kind of aimlessness should have felt heavy, but it didn't. It felt like space I hadn't had in years. I spent part of the day walking. There was a stretch of sidewalk along the main road that passed a dollar store, a closed laundromat, and a tiny thrift shop wedged between 2 auto repair garages. I went in not to shop but to linger. The air smelled like old carpet and lemon polish. I ran my fingers along worn-out coats, flipped through dog-eared novels, paused at a shelf of ceramic figurines, and wondered who had donated them and what moment of life they'd once represented. Around noon, I found a diner with chipped linoleum floors and a chalkboard menu. I ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup ate alone at a booth with torn red vinyl and read a local paper someone had left behind. It had been a long time since I'd read anything in print. My eyes lingered over every word, even the classified ads. Back at the motel by late afternoon, I unlocked the room with the metal key that always stuck slightly to the left. I stepped inside to the soft hum of the wall AC unit. The carpet was thin. The wallpaper bubbled near the baseboard, and the bedspread was stiff from overwashing, but none of that mattered. It was quiet, entirely my own. I set my shoes by the door, changed into a sweater, and sat at the desk by the window. I opened the red folder, the same one I had packed like a lifeline. I hadn't looked inside since arriving, but now I did just to make sure it was still real. My name in block letters typed clearly beside Caleb's, 49% co-owner. The document had been notarized, signed, recorded. I traced my fingertip across the seal. They hadn't mentioned it when they asked me to leave. Maybe they'd forgotten. Or maybe they had never understood what it really meant. But I had. From the moment I signed the papers, I knew what I had given and what I had preserved. The phone rang a little after 4 p.m. The number was unfamiliar. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something in me said answer. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was intuition. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear without speaking first. "Is this Irene Alden?" a man's voice asked. His tone was formal but not unfriendly. "Yes. My name is Dennis Shaw. I'm calling from Carolina Private Lending regarding a property you're listed on 722 Oak Ridge Drive. You're a co-owner." "Correct?" I sat up a little straighter. There's been a loan placed against the property. It was taken out approximately 11 months ago by the other owner, Mr. Caleb Alden, a business loan. Unfortunately, it's now in default." I closed my eyes. I didn't say anything. I heard Dennis take a breath on the other end. "We've sent 3 notices," he continued. "The loan was for $95,000. No payments have been made in 5 months. We've initiated foreclosure proceedings." I turned in my chair, staring out the window, watching a small bird peck at something in the gravel. "What do you need from me?" I asked quietly. "Since you're listed on the deed, we'll need your authorization to proceed. You have the option to assume the debt, or you can sign a release and allow the foreclosure to continue." I didn't ask any questions about the business. I didn't ask why Caleb hadn't told me. Somewhere deep down, I already knew. Pride, desperation. Maybe arrogance. Maybe all 3. Whatever the reason, the outcome was now mine to decide. Dennis offered to email me the paperwork. I gave him my backup email, one I rarely used, and hung up. The phone felt heavier than before, like the call had added something I couldn't shake off. I walked to the front office and asked to print the documents. The young man at the desk gave me a tired smile and slid the pages into the printer tray without asking what they were. I borrowed a pen from the counter, one of those promotional pens from a dentist's office, the plastic barrel chipped near the clip. Back in my room, I spread everything out on the desk. The deed, the loan documents, the foreclosure release forms. I sat down, slowly adjusted the lamp, and read every word. The legal language was dense but clear enough. I traced each paragraph with the tip of the pen, underlining dates, amounts, deadlines. My eyes didn't skip. I read until I understood everything. Then I signed. It took 4 slow signatures, each one deliberate. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I just felt done. I scanned the documents using the motel's small scanner behind the front desk and emailed them back with no message attached. Just the forms completed and clear. Dennis called me again about an hour later. He confirmed they had received the release and that the foreclosure would proceed. He asked if I had any questions. I told him no. "Thank you," I said, before hanging up. Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed with the red folder closed again, my hands resting on top of it. The light outside had begun to fade and the room grew dim. I didn't post anything on Facebook. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write in my journal. I made myself a bowl of oatmeal from a packet I'd brought in my bag, stirred it slowly, and ate it while watching the ceiling fan spin in lazy circles. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt still. The sun hadn't even fully risen when my phone buzzed again. It was early, too early for anyone to be texting unless it was urgent or panicked. I turned over slowly, the light outside barely filtering through the thin curtains. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't waiting for anything. I picked up the phone and saw Caleb's name flash across the screen. The message was short. "Did you cancel something with the house?" "We just got a weird letter from a lender." I stared at it for a moment, not blinking. I didn't reply. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and went to wash up. By the time I returned, there was another message. "There's a notice on the door. Call me." Still, I said nothing. Later that day, Lena's name popped up. Her text was longer, dotted with strained politeness. "Marilyn, please. We're confused. Just tell us what's going on." There were no apologies, no acknowledgement of what had come before, just fear disguised as confusion. I turned my phone off. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to hear the panic in her voice, not after everything. I wasn't ready to hear them ask questions they had no right to ask. By the next morning, I didn't have to wonder how they were reacting. Lena had posted in their neighborhood Facebook group, one of those communities filled with polite passive aggression and recipe swaps, where she usually shared photos of her garden or asked for power washing recommendations. This post was different. Urgent, our home may be under threat from a fraudulent lender. We believe we're being scammed. If anyone has a recommendation for a foreclosure attorney, please message me directly. It was a short post, but frantic in tone. The kind of thing meant to stir sympathy. I didn't reply. But I read every comment. People chimed in quickly. Neighbors, acquaintances. Caleb's old college friend, Devin. What happened? I thought you guys were doing well. That's awful. How can we help? Sending prayers. Lena responded to each one like a seasoned spokesperson under pressure. She never quite explained, never mentioned the loan, the co-ownership, the silence. Her replies were filled with vague statements about betrayal and unforeseen financial hardship. We trusted someone who turned on us. It's devastating when the people meant to protect you become the ones who hurt you. I sat on the motel bed watching the story unfold from the sidelines like an observer of a play I had once starred in. She didn't name me. Didn't have to. The implication was enough. She'd built a narrative around me, cast me as the villain in a story of their downfall. Caleb posted an old photo of the two of us, him as a child with chocolate smeared on his cheeks, sitting on my lap at a summer fair. He looked happy. I was mid-laugh hair windblown wearing my favorite denim jacket. The caption read, "It's hard when the people who raised you turn on you." There were no tags, no names, but everyone knew. And for a brief moment I felt something sting deep in my chest. Not anger, but a sadness so sharp it caught my breath. Not for myself, but for the memory they were now using like currency. A moment once full of joy repurposed for pity clicks. I thought about responding. I imagined posting screenshots, bank records, the deed. I imagined laying it all out so that no one could twist it again. But then I remembered something my father once told me many years ago when I came home crying after being falsely blamed for something at school. "Don't wrestle with pigs," he had said. "You'll both get dirty." And the pig likes it, so I stayed quiet. But silence didn't mean stillness. 3 days after the first text, there was a knock at my motel door. It wasn't loud, just 2 measured taps. I didn't move at first. I've lived long enough to know that hesitation can be a form of protection. The knock came again, a little softer. I walked over and opened the door just a crack. Lena stood outside, hair pulled into a rushed bun, her eyes red skin blotchy like she'd been crying but hadn't wanted to. In her arms was a baby bundled in a pale pink blanket. A diaper bag hung off her shoulder, too neat to be thrown on casually. She looked different. Frazzled, hesitant. "Marilyn," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm not here to fight. We don't know what to do anymore. I didn't open the door all the way. I wasn't ready to invite her in." She shifted the baby in her arms. "Her name's Emily," she said. "She's yours too. Don't shut us out." That hit harder than I expected. I hadn't known the baby's name. Hadn't asked. I'd avoided anything that made it real. I opened the door a few inches more, just enough for her to step inside. She looked around the motel room. Tiny, sparse, the corners stacked with 2 suitcases, a coffee mug, and a folded quilt. She walked to the edge of the bed and sat still, holding the baby. "We messed up," she said. "I said things I didn't mean. Caleb's too proud to say it, but he's drowning. We're both overwhelmed. Accounts are frozen, bills are stacking up." Her voice wavered. She looked down at the floor. But then I saw something. Small, out of place. A brand tag still attached to the diaper bag. I leaned slightly forward. It was from Posh Baby, a luxury brand I'd seen in a magazine just the week before. The bag alone retailed for over $900. That's new, I said, not accusing, just stating. She blinked. It was a gift, she said quickly. From a friend. I didn't respond. I walked toward the window. Parked outside was a sleek black SUV, polished, purring faintly with the engine still on. That wasn't desperation. That was performance. I turned around slowly, and everything in me knew. This visit wasn't about reconciliation. This was something else. 3 days had passed since the foreclosure notice went into motion, and I had settled into a quiet routine at the motel. The days were slow, the nights uneventful. There was a strange kind of comfort in the repetition. Coffee in the morning from the front desk, a short walk to the diner, a paperback in the afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I was beginning to forget what chaos felt like. That morning I had just finished folding my laundry when the knock came. 2 short taps measured cautious. I hesitated. Most people didn't knock at motels. They buzzed or called. My instincts sharpened. I stepped to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Lena. Her hair was loosely pulled back, strands sticking out around her temples like she'd dressed in a rush. Her face was bare, no makeup, eyes red, and she held something close to her chest, wrapped in soft pink. A baby. Emily. I opened the door just a crack. She looked relieved to see me, like she hadn't been sure I'd answer. "I'm not here to fight," she said quickly. "We don't know what to do anymore." I didn't say anything. I studied her face, her posture, the carefully folded blanket around the baby, the spotless diaper bag looped over her shoulder. She bounced the baby gently, the way nervous mothers do when they want to seem natural. Her voice softened. "Her name's Emily. She's yours too." I opened the door just enough for her to step inside. She did so carefully, as if entering a place where she no longer belonged. Her eyes scanned the room, the plain furniture, the zipped suitcases, the folded quilt at the end of the bed. She sat down slowly at the edge, still cradling the baby. "It's been a lot," she said. "More than we expected. We thought we had time to fix things before they got out of hand. But Caleb... He didn't tell you about the loan, did he?" I remained standing. "No," I replied. She nodded as if confirming a suspicion. "He didn't tell me either. Not at first. I found out months later. We were already behind. The business fell apart and everything else started falling with it." Her eyes began to glisten. She looked down at Emily, kissed the baby's forehead, then continued. "He's proud. You know how he is. He doesn't know how to ask for help. I tried to hold things together. I said some awful things. But I was scared. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something in her voice that didn't match the moment. A rehearsed edge. Too smooth. Too careful. As she adjusted the baby on her lap, the side pocket of the diaper bag shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something. A tag. Glossy white, still attached with plastic thread. My eyes focused. The brand name printed in cursive, Posh Baby. I had seen it just last week in a magazine at the front desk. Luxury diaper bags. Starting at $900. My gaze moved to the bag itself. Immaculate, not a scuff, not a smudge. It was too perfect to be old. "That's new," I said quietly, nodding toward the bag. She stiffened her fingers, tightening on the strap. It was a gift, she replied quickly. From a friend. Her voice cracked slightly, but the timing felt off. Too quick. Too ready. I took a step back and looked at her more carefully. Her clothes were clean coordinated. The baby's blanket was pristine. Her makeup may have been minimal, but her appearance wasn't disheveled. She didn't look like someone who had lost everything. She looked like someone who wanted to be seen as someone who had... I walked toward the window and looked outside. A black SUV idled by the curb. The engine was running. The paint was polished. The tires were spotless. This wasn't desperation. This was something else. "You came here to get something," I said without turning. She stood bouncing Emily again, her voice shaky. "I came to ask for help." "No," I said, turning around slowly. "You came to film something." I walked closer. She flinched instinctively, clutching the baby tighter. I kept my voice low, steady. I saw the phone in the open side pocket of the bag. The screen was still on. The camera app open. We just wanted proof, she whispered. In case you twisted the story again. Again, I said, raising an eyebrow. You've already twisted it once? She didn't deny it. Her lips parted as if to explain, but nothing came out. You think bringing the baby would soften me? I said, each word heavier than the last. That I'd crumble if you showed me her name, her face, her tiny hands. You came here to perform suffering. No, she said, but her voice was barely a whisper now. I stepped back. Get out. She didn't move. I'm not your storyline, I said. I'm not your villain. And I'm certainly not your ATM. She stood slowly. Still holding Emily, still carrying the $900 bag. She's your granddaughter, she said, her voice cracking. I looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing cruel in my tone. Just a clarity she didn't expect. No, I said, she's your daughter. And you'd better raise her to treat people better than you treated me. Lena didn't reply. She walked toward the door, shoulders stiff. The SUV pulled away smoothly as she stepped outside like a scene rehearsed in reverse. I closed the door behind her, locked it, then stood in the quiet of the motel room, letting the stillness settle around me like armor. My hands shook not from fear, but from the rush of knowing I had drawn a line, because in that moment I realized something with total clarity. Something they had never expected me to remember, let alone act on. They brought a baby to play victim. I brought receipts. After Lena left, I stood in the middle of the room for a long time. The sound of the SUV fading down the road seemed to stretch longer than it should have. My hands were still unsteady, the echo of her words still hovering somewhere in the air. But there was nothing more to be said, nothing more to dissect. She had come to bait me into emotion, and I hadn't given it. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't broken down. I had stood my ground not by force, but by choosing not to be pulled back into their mess. I sat down on the bed and picked up the red folder again. This time, I didn't open it. I simply placed it in my lap, rested my palms over it, and breathed. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a shield, one I'd quietly carried while everyone around me assumed I had nothing. Later that night after dinner, a microwavable baked potato and half a banana. I opened my notebook for the first time in weeks. It had lived at the bottom of my bag, wedged between a paperback mystery and my reading glasses. The cover was creased and the pages had curled slightly at the corners from moisture. I smoothed it open to a fresh page and began to write. Not poetry, not a plan, just facts, names, dates, things I had overheard and pretended not to. Things they had said in whispers and behind doors they thought were shut. I wrote down the text messages. I wrote about the loan, the foreclosure, the brand tag on the diaper bag. I wrote about the camera app open on Lena's phone. I wrote not with anger, but with precision. If they ever tried to spin the story again, I would not be caught off guard. The next morning, I walked down to the county courthouse and filed for a temporary restraining order. The clerk didn't raise an eyebrow when I explained what had happened. In fact, she didn't seem surprised at all. She quietly stapled my documents, slid a packet across the desk, and said, "You're not the first. You won't be the last." Her voice wasn't unkind, just tired, like she'd seen too many women come through those doors holding paper shields instead of protection. Back at the motel, I made 5 copies of the filing, one for myself, one for the motel manager, one for the local precinct, one for the housing board rep I'd met during the condo search, and one to be mailed to Caleb and Lena's last known address. I didn't include a letter, just a neon tab on the first page. They wanted legal. They got legal. That evening I opened my email. Amid spam and old receipts was a message from a local journalist. Someone at Charlotte Magazine had caught wind of the foreclosure post on Facebook and the swirl of speculation that followed. The journalist's message was polite, curious, and careful. They weren't interested in gossip. They wanted the truth. For a few minutes, I hovered over the reply button. I wasn't sure if I wanted to respond. I wasn't interested in going viral or putting my family's name in headlines. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence didn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence let the wrong version of a story spread like mold, and I'd had enough mold for one lifetime, so I wrote back. I attached scans of the deed, the notarized loan documents, the foreclosure release, the screenshots of Lena's texts, and even a photo of the designer diaper bag with the brand tag still dangling. No caption, no dramatic retelling. Just the facts lined up like quiet footsteps in a hallway no one thought I was walking down. In the subject line, I typed 5 words. Since they want to talk. And then I hit send. I closed the laptop gently and slid it beneath the bed. The room was dark by then, the lamp casting a warm circle across the desk. Outside, the sky was purple-gray, and a soft rain had started to fall, tapping lightly against the window. I didn't check my phone again that night. I didn't wait for a response. For the first time in a long time, I let the quiet be enough. The article was published the following Sunday. I found it waiting in my inbox when I returned from the diner with my usual paper cup of coffee and a warm cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper. The email subject line simply read, "Preview final layout attached." I clicked it open at the small desk in my motel room, the red folder still tucked in the drawer below. The article filled 3 full pages. My name was there, Irene Alden, right beside the headline, "When Help Becomes Leverage One Mother's Account of Financial Betrayal." They hadn't sensationalized it. There were no exaggerated quotes, no out-of-context sound bites. Just a quiet, steady recounting of what had happened, how I'd used my life insurance to help my son buy a home, how I was gently pushed out, how the house was leveraged behind my back, and how I had chosen to let the foreclosure play out instead of rescuing them a second time. They even included a sidebar about elder co-ownership and the rise in financial abuse within families. The photo of the diaper bag was placed beside a quote from the housing board about luxury spending during default proceedings. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. By the end of the day, my phone began to buzz again. But this time, the tone had changed. Messages came in from people I hadn't heard from in years. A cousin in Atlanta. A woman I'd taught with back in the 90s. A neighbor from the old neighborhood who had once borrowed my garden shears and never returned them. All of them had read the article. Most began the same way. I had no idea. "You didn't deserve that. You were always the kind one." They didn't ask me to explain further. They didn't dig for gossip. They simply believed me. In the same neighborhood Facebook group where Lena had posted her frantic call for legal advice, a new thread began. This one, sharing the article. Someone wrote, "Just read this. I think there's more to that foreclosure story than we were told." Another replied, "I had no idea she was a co-owner. That changes everything." And the responses kept coming, not in waves but in small, steady ripples. People began discussing elder financial abuse, the cost of silence, the quiet power of boundaries. I watched as the narrative shifted, not with force but with fact, not because I shouted but because I had spoken just once clearly. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a shadow trailing behind someone else's version of events. People didn't call me a villain anymore. They didn't call me a victim either. They called me Irene, and somehow that was enough. But the moment I knew something had truly changed came a few days later. I was walking back from the grocery store a few blocks from the motel. I'd gone early before the heat set in, carrying a small canvas tote with eggs, a jar of peanut butter, and a single peach that had bruised slightly on the way home. As I turned the corner toward the motel, I spotted someone sitting alone at a patio table outside the cafe across the street. It was Caleb. He was hunched over a hoodie pulled low over his forehead, nursing a paper cup between both hands, like it held answers instead of coffee. He didn't look up at first, but as I moved into the sunlight, he glanced up. Our eyes met. There was no wave, no nod. He didn't stand or call out. He just looked at me, and in that look, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not guilt, Not anger. Just distance. A quiet recognition that what had once been mother and son caretaker and child protector and protected was now something else entirely. Not broken, but unrecognizable. I didn't stop walking. I crossed the street and returned to my motel room. I set the groceries on the desk, placed the peach gently in the drawer with my notebook, and sat down. A few hours later, an email arrived. No subject line, no greeting. Just 12 words. I read the article. I won't contact you again. I'm sorry you felt like you had no choice. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it or save it or reread it. I just archived it and closed the laptop. Because it wasn't really an apology. It wasn't even a beginning. It was the sound of a door clicking shut. And this time, I let it close all the way. It was a Tuesday when the motel manager knocked on my door holding a stack of mail he said had been redirected from my old address. I thanked him, took the bundle, and sat down at the small desk by the window. Most of it was what I expected. Flyers from pharmacies. I no longer used a newsletter from a church I hadn't attended since Daniel passed a soft envelope from a local bank asking if I was interested in refinancing a home I no longer owned. But at the very bottom, nestled between a pizza coupon and a magazine subscription card, was a manila envelope with a logo I recognized immediately. Harbor View Living, Senior Housing and Retirement Resources. I held it for a moment before opening it. Not because I was nervous, but because it felt like something final. A door either opening or staying shut. Inside was a single letter on cream-colored stationery signed by Irene, the soft-spoken woman I'd met at the Wilmington Housing Board over 2 months ago. We'd talked briefly back then before everything fell apart, when I was still clinging to the hope that my place in Caleb's house was real secure. But something had nudged me to apply anyway. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the part of me that had been through enough life to know hope is fragile. And preparation is not betrayal. Her letter was short, just 3 sentences. Irene, we're happy to let you know your application for Unit 2B has been approved. The keys are available at the front office anytime after Wednesday. Welcome home. Attached was a brochure, a 2-bedroom condo in a quiet corner of Wilmington, walking distance from the ocean with a 2nd-floor balcony and a shared community garden. There were weekly potlucks, a library room, and yoga on Thursdays. Rent was modest, utilities included. Pets allowed. I stared at the paper for a long time, the tip of my finger tracing the map of the complex. My eyes lingered on the words ocean breeze and independent living. The words felt like a balm. That evening I packed. I didn't rush. I folded the same clothes I had unpacked weeks ago, the ones that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets and motel air conditioning. I zipped up my quilt and wrapped Daniel's photograph in it again, just as carefully as I had when I left Caleb's house. The same 2 suitcases, the same leather tote I'd used for years. But this time it didn't feel like I was running. It felt like I was moving forward. I paused only once, when I reached into the drawer for the red folder. I held it not out of necessity, but out of ritual. Setsi. It had been my anchor, my silent witness, the thing that reminded me I wasn't helpless even when others tried to make me feel like I was. I tucked it inside my bag, unsure if I'd ever need it again, but knowing I wasn't ready to let it go. Before I left, I sat at the desk and opened my will. I had already removed Caleb's name in the days following the foreclosure. That part had been surprisingly easy. What took longer was deciding where everything else should go. I listed 3 beneficiaries. First, a women's shelter just outside of Charlotte specializing in helping women over 50 escape financial dependency and abuse. Second, a literacy nonprofit that offered reading programs and GED tutoring for older adults. I'd volunteered there years ago, and I still remembered the woman who cried the first time she read a birthday card aloud to her granddaughter. And third, the animal rescue where I had walked dogs every Saturday before I moved in with Caleb and Lena. They'd named a calico kitten after me once. The condo would go to them as well, the one I hadn't yet stepped into but already felt like home. At the bottom of the will, I added one final instruction for my attorney. If Caleb or Lena challenge this release, everything, publicly, no exception. I signed the page, sealed the envelope, and left it with the motel manager for overnight delivery. The next morning I checked out with nothing but a nod and a thank you. I didn't explain where I was going. No one asked. It was the kind of silence that didn't sting. It simply allowed. The new place was smaller than I expected, but brighter. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors from tall windows that faced a line of trimmed hedges and a narrow path leading toward the beach. The balcony was just wide enough for a chair and a small table. I stood there for a while, listening to the hush of waves somewhere beyond the rooftops. Not loud, not cinematic, just steady. I unpacked slowly, placing each item with care. My books on the shelves, my sweaters in the drawer, Daniel's photo on the windowsill, and on the kitchen counter I placed a single object I hadn't mentioned to anyone, a seashell. I had picked it up 3 days ago from a woman selling crafts at the boardwalk. She was older, wore a scarf tied under her chin, and had arranged all her shells in neat little rows, each one painted with delicate silver edges. I didn't plan to buy anything, but she looked at me and said without asking anything, "That one's for people who've just let go of something heavy." It was a small shell, pale blue with a glint of metallic shimmer, no bigger than a thumbprint. I had held it all the way home. Now it sat in the center of my kitchen counter, catching the late afternoon light. I named it Peace, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew no one could take it from me. If you've ever felt like you were slowly pushed out of a life you helped build, if you've ever given everything for your family only to be left behind in silence, then maybe you saw a piece of yourself in Irene's story. Have you ever been told in words or in looks that you were too much or in the way? And if so, what did you do with that quiet heartbreak? We share these stories not for drama, but for dignity. To remind every woman who's ever felt erased that your voice, your story, your presence still matters. If Irene's journey moved you, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe more women deserve to be seen and heard, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of revenge is reclaiming your peace. Thank you for listening. Tang.